Okay. Well, good evening, folks. Welcome to another edition of Alumni Sparks, brought to you by the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. I'm Amanda Graham. I'm your host for this evening. I am the academic director at the Irving Institute, and we started this series for two reasons that sort of combine into one reason, actually. One reason is because we have this incredible crop of alumni from Dartmouth who are working or have worked in the energy industry in some way, shape, or form. And they are so excited and enthusiastic to share their stories and experiences with our Dartmouth students. The second reason is we have this amazing crop of Dartmouth students who are interested in both learning more about energy careers for the first time, or maybe for the second time if you've seen another one in our series, or know that you want to go into energy and you want to dig deep and you want to really get as much information as you can about a particular area of the energy industry. So we're really trying to meet both of those needs of all of those students and all of those alumni. And so it's really been a pleasure for us to launch this series this spring to help folks explore and also navigate, what is a really challenging job market right now, job and internship market right now. And so I'm delighted to have you with us. I'm going to ask if you'd be willing to show your faces, because it's so much more fun for our speakers and for me to see you if we can, while we are in conversation together here tonight. So please go ahead and show your faces if you can. I think you can. I think you should be able to. And now I'm going to, there, clearly you can. Thanks, Eleanor. Hi there. Everybody is going to be muted at the start. And then when after Aimee gives us her comments, hey there, another face, glad to see you. You'll be able to ask questions. And what I'll have you do is to use the raise hand function in Zoom so that I know that you have a question, and then I'll unmute you so you can go ahead and pose the question yourself directly to Aimee when we get to that conversational part. And if you're having any difficulty or have any questions, just go ahead and send me a chat. Hey, Max. And I'll do my best to keep an eye on that. Well, without further ado, I want to do a very quick intro for our speaker. So Aimee Barnes from the class of 2004 is with us tonight. And Aimee was an ENVS major at Dartmouth, and she has had a really interesting career working in climate policy in a number of capacities, both working for the state of California and working in an international context as well with the United Arab Emirates and with border issues with Mexico, and has been working for a number of years with Governor Jerry Brown in California, and now as a senior advisor to him in the California Climate Institute, which I'm eager to learn a lot more about. And one of the things that Aimee asked that we do is to ask you just a couple of questions as we get going. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll, and if you could fill in your replies, that would be super. And Aimee, I'm going to ask you to go right ahead and introduce yourself and take it away so we can hear a little bit more about how you got to where you are now.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda, for having me. And thank you to all of you for joining on this Wednesday evening with all of this craziness that's going on. So as Amanda said, I'm a Dartmouth class of 2004, and I've spent about the past 15 years or so, basically since I graduated, working in the energy, climate, and environment space. Most recently worked as a senior advisor for Jerry Brown. But Amanda had kind of asked me to talk a little bit, to start off by talking a little bit about kind of my relationship to Dartmouth. So maybe I can start there. I'd love it if this could be as interactive as possible. So I know, Amanda, you had some questions teed up, but I hope folks will feel free to kind of just let this be a free-flowing conversation and get engaged and chat.
That sounds great. And I think everybody can see the poll results now. So we've got both folks from ENVS, Gov, Engineering, and Social Sciences for our in our audience right now.
That's great. So maybe just a little bit about how I ended up at Dartmouth and my experience there. I grew up in the California Bay Area, which is where I live now. And basically, went to Dartmouth because it was like the farthest away that I could get from the Bay Area. And it was that in very many respects. And really, I was sort of an accidental environmental studies major. I entered Dartmouth as a film major because I was really interested in sort of the impact of and the power of media to influence people. And then became a sociology major because I was really interested in sort of how social systems work and what makes people and groups of people tick. But then about halfway through my junior year, my one of my professors said, you know, you basically have all the classes done to be an environmental studies major. So I was. um, but you know, I guess I just mentioned that to say that I think I feel like I remember feeling a lot of pressure to kind of have a clear path. I felt like there were a lot of kids that sort of, you know, came in knowing that they were going to be doctors and, you know, did a certain set of coursework or knew they were going to be engineers or whatever. Although it may seem as though my career has taken a very sort of deliberate path, it definitely has not. So I think that my first piece of advice is just that, like, you are the thread that kind of ties everything through your career, starting from, you know, even as a kid, your interests, up through college and through your professional life. So, you know, I guess I would just encourage you to always sort of feel comfortable in your skin and those decisions you make, and making those changes. I think really dabbling in lots of different areas will make you, you know, more well-rounded and really a more sort of interesting work candidate for professional opportunities. So that's one thing I would say. You know, the other thing I just would mention is that growing up in the Bay Area, Dartmouth was definitely a big culture shock for me. I came from a very sort of diverse public school experience, lots of different languages, like different cultures, raised in a very sort of working class single mom situation. So Dartmouth was not always, you know, not always an environment where I felt totally at home. And I feel like when I was trying to prepare for this, I was thinking a lot about sort of senior year and what you go through as a senior, starting to figure out what you're going to do the next year, all the sort of recruiting process that happens, you know, all of the big finance and consulting companies that are on campus. I definitely did not do any of that. I did not graduate with a job. I worked retail for the first year after college and sort of found my way through to what I wanted to do gradually. So I know it can feel like a lot of pressure right now to sort of like have it all figured out, have a job lined up. But that is not the case for a lot of us. And that's totally fine. So I hope if that's where you are, you feel good about it. If that's not where you are and you have it all figured out, then congratulations. You are, you know, doing great too. um, and you know, the other thing I guess I would say is that looking back, Dartmouth has so many great resources. You know, the Career Center, the Environmental Studies Program, the Irving Institute, obviously. And I think I felt a little bit sheepish about always taking advantage of those. If you guys are on this Zoom meeting, then you're already clearly taking a great first step. But especially with kind of the current pandemic and the economic climate, I think there are so many great opportunities and resources on campus. So I think feeling free to take advantage of those, even after you've graduated for, you know, the first couple years, there's lots of great resources for young alumni, lots of great networks. You guys know Dartmouth people are very enthusiastic about Dartmouth. So taking advantage of those is great. But so like I mentioned, I spent my first year after Dartmouth working retail, and then through sort of a series of personal decisions ended up back here in the Bay Area. I applied for a lot of jobs before I got my first job, which was at the Natural Resources Defense Council. It's if people don't know it, it's a pretty large national and internationally operating environmental nonprofit. And you know, my first job was really essentially sort of a secretary job. actually using some of the skills I'd gained working in the development office at the Hopkins Center. So shout out to the Hop. But I think one of the things that was really great about that is that it gave me a window into the kind of work that I wanted to do. It was a really great work environment. And so from that perspective, I think especially early on, the organization almost is sometimes more important than the role you're serving, because it'll give you an opportunity to see people in more senior roles and kind of figure out like, oh, that's a job, I want to do. And that was definitely my experience at NRDC. I worked for 4 really amazing women who continue to be role models to me, and they taught me a lot, how to be a good boss and a female professional, and also just the value of working with good people. And so, I think if you get an opportunity to work in an organization that has good people, that's really priceless. The other thing that I would take away from that experience is I got to work there on a lot of different California state policy. So I supported the California state policy program. And while I was there, I worked on a bill called AB 32, which is California's sort of foundational climate law that was passed in 2006. And I didn't really realize it at the time, but working on that law, on the passage of that bill, and then some of the processes afterward to turn that bill into regulation, gave me a set of skills that ended up being really helpful after graduate school, even a few years later as I was entering the job market. And so again, it may not be deliberate. You never really know sometimes which experiences are going to be valuable to a future employer, but that was a professional opportunity early on for me that then really opened up some opportunities later on. The thing that I really learned at NRDC was that I wanted to go on and get an advanced degree. Looking around, I kind of was able to look at people who had the kinds of jobs that I was interested in having. And, all of them had, either a JD or a PhD or master's in policy. And so that's really what inspired me to go back to graduate school. And I'm really glad that I took that time and had, a couple of years working before I did graduate school. On the one hand, I think a global pandemic and financial crisis is always a good time to continue your education and not enter the workforce if that's something you can afford and you're ready to do. But I'm also really glad that I had a little bit of professional experience under my belt for a couple of reasons. I think it made me a better student. It made me more focused on what I was interested in. It made me a more interesting colleague and classmate to some of the other people in my program. And honestly, school is hard. What you guys have been doing for the last 4 years is hard. And a lot of the students that came directly from undergrad into grad school were really burnt out from doing schoolwork, and I think would have benefited from having had a break in between. So that's one reason that I'm glad I kind of took a pause there. So I applied to grad school and got into the School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, at Columbia. And I did their 1-year master's in environmental science and policy. Grad school was really wonderful. And for me, it was all about really 3 things. I think a lot of people talk about the importance of networking in grad school. And I think it was definitely that, but a lot more. I would say that the people in my program have become lifelong friends, not just colleagues professionally, but people who have, come to my wedding and whose kids know each other. And so I think that was definitely something that was really critical. Gaining confidence and refining my skills. I actually ended up, I think, knowing a lot of what was covered in my grad program thanks to my work as an undergrad at Dartmouth in the environmental studies program. But I think also just being able to be with a cohort of other students and realizing like, okay, I actually, I have some good knowledge here. I think that was really important. And then, of course, just the opportunities that it opened professionally would be the third thing. And I think that came both in the form of just simply the piece of paper that says you're qualified to do this work that some employers require, but also the internship opportunity that it afforded me through the network at that school. And so the internship that I did in grad school became basically my job after graduate school. Working for a company called Eco Securities. And that was, at the time, the largest global developer of clean energy and greenhouse gas emission reducing projects under this UN framework called the Clean Development Mechanism. So basically, if you ever heard of an offset project, we were developing UN approved offsets that were to be bought and sold and traded under the Kyoto Protocol, which is sort of the precursor to the Paris Agreement. So long time ago in the history of international climate negotiations. And I would say, that was a wonderful job. We grew as a company from 50 to 350 people in the span of about a year. The company went public. I had a lot of opportunities that were presented to me as a very young professional that I probably wouldn't have had in a larger and more established company, which I think is a benefit of being in that kind of startup environment. I remember, I think my first or second week there, one of the co-founders who I worked very closely with, his desk was right across from me and he shouted at me, "You speak Spanish, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, uh-huh." He was like, "Okay, do you want to go to Chile next week and present about our company at this conference?" And it was very intimidating. I had not used Spanish professionally, but took the opportunity, got to go to Chile for like a whirlwind 4-day trip. And off the back of that, ended up getting to do a lot of public speaking and presenting for the company. So I think definitely taking opportunities when they're presented to you. Don't be shy. Don't undersell yourself or sort of undercut yourself. Even when you're young, I think you can step into opportunities like that more than you may think. And then I also started to learn about things that I really enjoyed and really was good at. And I think that's sort of a big part of that early stage of your career is just learning what things you like to do and don't like to do. Because I've talked to a lot of people who are looking to get into working on climate or energy, and people always say, well, how do I get into that? How do I break into the sector? And the honest truth is, yes, it requires some knowledge and some learning to work on climate, but all of that, is stuff that you can learn. I think what's really important is finding out what you enjoy doing. So do you like talking to people? Do you hate talking to people and you like writing and being in an office by yourself? Do you really need to be outdoors and not behind a desk? Understanding those things about yourself are, I think, really important for sort of your long-term professional success. So I think not being afraid to sort of try on lots of different hats early on in your career and just getting a sense of what you do and don't like is important, and giving yourself permission to do that. Speaking of things you don't like, my next step in my career, I actually met my husband working at Eco Securities. He worked in the UK and I was working in the Los Angeles office. And so I decided to move to London with him. And again, through a friend and somebody in my network from graduate school, got a job working for the Department of Energy and Climate Change, which no longer exists, but at the time was sort of the main part of the UK government that was responsible for leading climate and energy policy. It was an amazing opportunity, and I'm really glad in retrospect that I did it. But at the time, I really didn't like the job. I felt like a fish on a bicycle, I think is the metaphor. A fish riding a bicycle. It was very quantitatively focused. It was actually in the midst of the sort of 2008 financial crisis. The focus of the job was figuring out how to deliver on the policy objectives of the department with a 40% budget cut because the government was going through really severe, fiscal challenges. And so basically my job was going around to people who ran these really amazing programs and saying, you're going to have a lot less money. How can you do this program? And if you can't do it with less money, then, we're going to have to consider cutting your program. So basically just going around and killing people's dreams all day long, things that they had worked really hard on. And that was no fun. But I learned a lot about myself. I learned that I didn't like doing that. And I got a lot better, at spreadsheets and negotiating. A lot of our work was negotiating with the Treasury, with other agencies. I got better at briefing. I had to brief the Secretary of State, Ed Miliband, who was also then subsequently leader of his party. So all of that was really great experience, but it wasn't for me. And so that was a good thing to learn about myself. And so, I know I think that this is advice that you will probably get less so these days, but sometimes people will say, oh, you have to stay in a job for, X amount of time. I got advice to stay in that job for a year, and I think that was probably about the right amount of time to stay in a job that I didn't really like. Um, but from that job, I got the opportunity to move to the United Arab Emirates. I was recruited to go there for a 2-year contract, and it was a really nice combination of doing the policy work that I enjoyed, but being in a more entrepreneurial environment. Again, this was in the midst of the financial crisis, and my husband and I had been applying for jobs back here in the US with no luck. So one thing I would just mention is that sometimes living abroad, can be a really incredible opportunity if it's something that is interesting to you or available to you. Sometimes the circumstances in different countries are different economically, and so there are job opportunities that may not present themselves here. So definitely something I really enjoyed and would recommend. And I got to work on the UN climate negotiations, on a whole bunch on the sustainable development goals, helping negotiate the sustainable development goals. Traveled a ton for my job, really loved it. But my husband and I had agreed that we would move back to California. And so in 2013, we did that. And I took almost a year off. And I would also highly recommend taking time off at some point in your career, or many points in your career. I did some consulting, but I was probably working 5 to 10 hours a week and really mostly spending my time networking, talking to people, and figuring out what I wanted to do next, and applying to a lot of jobs that I didn't get. But through that process of talking to people, I also spent a lot of time kind of journaling and writing and refining my ideas of what I wanted to do. And that really helped because essentially what happened was I was presented with 2 job opportunities at the same time. One was to be a partner at this firm called Allotrope, which I did end up working at a little bit, and I'll talk about that in a sec. And one was to go into the Brown administration, work for Jerry Brown at the California Environmental Protection Agency as a deputy secretary. And through the process that I had been kind of doing of really thinking about what I wanted to do, I had gotten to the conclusion that I really wanted to continue to work on public policy. And so having kind of gone through that thought process really helped me help me make that decision, which was a really difficult decision, but was a great decision. Working at Cal IPA was great. I highly recommend for those of you who are interested in public policy world, working in state government, especially, working in a state like California. It's a big state. It's on any given day, the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. I helped build out our international program. So this was in the lead up to the Paris Agreement. And so I implemented our memorandum of understanding with China. I negotiated and implemented our agreement with Mexico, helped build a coalition of lots of subnational jurisdictions to support a strong outcome at Paris. And also got to work on our border relations program, as Amanda mentioned, helping clean up the very serious, some of the very serious environmental issues at the California-Mexico border. I learned a lot. I learned how to get things done in government. It was really a great fit for me. But I also worked all the time. I had our first kid during that time. I took 8 weeks off for maternity leave, which I don't know if that sounds like a lot or a little, but an 8-week-old baby is not very old. It was definitely not enough. And definitely just was not a sustainable life. So in 2015, I decided to leave. I felt like we had gotten to the Paris Agreement. I thought Hillary Clinton's going to be president. It's all going to be fine. That obviously didn't necessarily go the way that I had planned. So I had been at Allotrope, I think less than a year when the election happened, and ended up getting pulled back into the governor's office this time to work on response to the Trump administration. Which was super fast paced and even less of a work-life balance. So I worked on a lot of coalition building, so helped start the US Climate Alliance, which is this group of now 25 states that have committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement, even in the absence of leadership from the Trump administration. We announced that on the day that Trump pulled out of Paris. But we are still in coalition, which is a broader group of cities, states, businesses, faith groups that's broadly committed to the principles of Paris. America's Pledge, which is a cooperation between Jerry Brown and Mike Bloomberg on tracking progress towards goals. And then ran something called the Global Climate Action Summit, which was a big event that happened in 2018 here in the Bay Area, bringing together basically like thousands of delegates from all over the world, trying to build momentum to push countries to make bigger, more ambitious climate commitments, acknowledging that Paris was great, it was unprecedented, but also the commitments that were made at Paris are not sufficient to get us to a climate safe pathway. That was really rewarding work. I also worked on our carbon neutrality executive order. So getting the state to commit to achieving economy-wide carbon neutrality by 2045 or as fast as possible, which is the most ambitious climate target in the country. So that was great. And I really enjoyed it, but it was also not sustainable. Those are the kinds of jobs that I would not recommend doing forever. You can do them it's a sprint, not a marathon. So you can do them for a few years and then you got to, I think, at least for me, I had to take a little bit of a step back. So currently I'm advising former Governor Brown and the California China Climate Institute, where we're continuing to foster a lot of the collaboration that he started as governor with China on climate issues. I'm an advisor to the Elemental Accelerator, which is a startup, clean energy startup accelerator based in Hawaii with a significant presence here in California, helping advise their companies on policy, because policy is super relevant to startup companies. Doing some campaign work and serving on a couple of boards and trying to make some time to figure out my next move and what I want to be when I grow up. So that's me. Maybe I can just stop there. I feel like I've been talking for way too long, and I'd love to chat, answer questions, discuss, debate, whatever.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Aimee. I see that Max has a question, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute him. I do want to make sure that you have a chance also to give your perspective on, the energy climate job situation today when you have a chance. But Max, go for it.
Yeah, so thanks again for coming. I thought it was super interesting that you said you worked in the UK and also the UAE. I also lived in Dubai for like 5 or 6 years. So I was just interested to hear what were the main barriers culturally to your job. And the government works pretty different than how the US government works and their policy and developing that.
Yeah. I'd love to hear about your experience in Dubai. My experience was I was recruited out of the UK government to help the UAE start a new team in their Ministry of Foreign Affairs to reorient their foreign policy around climate and energy. So around the time that I started that job, the UAE won their bid to host the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. And winning the right to host an international organization like that is sort of like bidding to host the Olympics. It's a huge diplomatic endeavor, which essentially involved them sending out, very senior officials, Minister of Foreign Affairs, President, Prime Minister, to talk to countries all over the world to convince them to let them have this honor. And basically what they heard from from many countries was, we love the idea of an oil-rich nation hosting this center focused on renewable energy. The UAE had been making a lot of investments in clean energy, so I think there was a lot of support from that perspective. But the UAE was still in the international climate talks and in other UN-based negotiations, blocking with Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries to try to obstruct progress on an agreement. And so basically, a number of countries said, we will support you in this, but you need to make a change with respect to your foreign policy on climate and energy. And so we were brought in to help set up this new directorate to basically do that work. We got to, help write policy positions on pretty much everything. In a lot of ways, it was a very comfortable for me, having worked in a sort of entrepreneurial environment, because we weren't given a lot of direction other than come up with some really good new ideas. And that was really fun because it gave us a lot of latitude to be creative. I think I get a lot of questions about what it was like to be a woman working in that environment. And as you probably know, the UAE is, of that region, sort of one of the most, if not the most progressive country. So in a lot of ways, I think it was not difficult. I think also there is definitely a very clear difference in terms of expectations for Westerners versus Emiratis. But a lot of what I spent my time on as well was mentoring Emirati women who were in the foreign service, helping them kind of come up as diplomats and develop their climate related expertise. We built out some programs through something called the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is something that the US and 20 other countries have participated in. It still is a program that exists. I never really felt like, I was hindered in my work for any reason. I think, if anything, people had a lot of respect for, outside experts, and I had a lot of latitude, and ultimately you run into a lot of the same bureaucratic and sort of political challenges that you run into in any government, which is, I think if you have if you're supported by somebody who's your boss, who has the right political connections and is persuasive, then you can get a lot of things done. And I was very fortunate that we had that leadership.
I think, Amanda, you're still on mute.
Thanks. Iris, I'm going to unmute you.
Awesome.
Oh, there you go. Yes.
Hi, Aimee. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm also from Alameda. Yes. I went to Payton Elementary, so grew up in the area, so very excited.
That's where my son goes. He's in kindergarten at Payton, yes.
Very cool. Yeah, so love the area. I wanted to ask you, as is I'm sure a big question these days, how the current pandemic, and especially how that's going to cause the private sector to really pull back on spending and investment, just because so many of them are in survival mode now. I was curious how you thought that would affect future investment in the coming years in terms of transitioning to more renewable or sustainable energy sources and supply chains. I know that that was an area of a lot of excitement in the past couple of years when capital was flowing pretty freely, and so now it seems like economic conditions are very different.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the short answer is nobody knows what will happen, but I think we all know what needs to happen if we want to live in a habitable planet in the future. Um, and so there are a lot of people that are thinking and working hard to kind of help governments and companies figure out how to weather the current pandemic and not take their foot off the gas. That's a bad metaphor in this instance, but not slow down their efforts to decarbonize. In California, for example, on the one hand, the governor just released his revised budget, which has pretty significant cuts to climate spending, including completely removing a $1 billion climate catalyst fund that was supposed to be launched. There was a climate resilience bond that was supposed to be on the ballot this November, which is no longer being advanced, I think because the supporters probably just felt like it was not the right environment to be asking people to be, paying more. And even the state's cap and trade program, which generates revenue from the sale of its allowances, has been generating less money. Partially, that has to do with just sort of the way the program works. And the end of last year, essentially there was need for fewer credits to be purchased on the market. So there's that, but also, one of the sort of funny side effects of everything that's happened has obviously been a reduction in economic activity, which leads to a reduction in greenhouse gases, which is a great short-term benefit, but that also reduces the revenue from a program that puts a price on emissions. So anyways, that's a very long-winded way of saying that's just one example of how I think we're seeing state budgets being impacted. And so we're all going to have to figure out how to do all of this and more with less. So I think that's definitely concerning. I think, it's interesting thinking about the time that I spent in UK government, because what we were really trying to figure out was how to continue to achieve our policy objectives during a time of severe fiscal consolidation. And what I learned from that experience is that sometimes it actually can be a real blessing, because it can force decisions that would otherwise be too politically difficult to do during flusher times. So for example, one area that I think is potentially ripe for this in California and elsewhere is looking at oil and gas transition. This is something that California has been grappling with, despite everything that the state does on climate. We're still also a major oil producer. Those are good six-figure salary jobs in parts of the state that otherwise don't have a lot of economic opportunity. That industry has now had the bottom drop out from underneath it. And so I think that presents an opportunity if we can think creatively to say, what does a future look like for the people who work in this industry to be retrained and have new opportunities. And so I think I'm a pretty optimistic, like glass half full person. So I try to think about how these kinds of crises create opportunities for us to think in new ways. In terms of, the question of what that does for job prospects for people like you guys who are trying to sort of enter this world as young professionals. I think in the private sector, certainly, I think there will be a lot of, all the tech companies here in the Bay Area, for example. I think it's, they're probably going to be focusing a lot less on some of their sustainability initiatives. I could imagine that those teams may be some of the first to go. I remember back in 2008, that definitely was an area that got hit hard. But, an area that I see that is growing and growing even in the face of all of this, everything else, is climate philanthropy. There have been really significant commitments made by a number of philanthropies to scale their climate giving, and that is continuing. And I just in the past few weeks have heard of at least 2 instances where there are multi-$100 million new foundations that are being set up to continue to support climate work. So I think there's growth, and there will be continued growth in that area, just in recognition of the fact that there's, we need to get there. And then 2 other things I would say, depending on what happens with stimulus, and I think this will be a really case by case and state by state basis, but I think there could be some really exciting opportunities around stimulus spending, both in the public sector to figure out how that gets spent, and then in the private sector and startup world figuring out how to spend it. And then also, obviously, what happens in November is going to be huge in terms of determining what happens over the next 4 years. Now might be a great time to work on a political campaign if that's something that's up your alley. I know, obviously there's a lot at stake at the national level, but there are a lot of great climate focused candidates that I know all the way down the ballot. I think we really need climate advocates at every level of government to make change on the scale that's required. So, whether it's working for the Biden campaign or, the Alameda City Council campaign, or whatever it is, I think that's all really important.
Thank you so much.
Are you planning to come back to Alameda, or what's your plan for next steps?
Yes, I'm actually staying in Hanover right now because it wasn't great for traveling, given the situation, but my family's back home, and so yes, I'm planning to move back home once it's safer to travel.
Got it.
Great, thanks so much for that question and discussion. Other questions from the group? Anyone have a hand to raise? So I'll ask a question. Oh, no, I won't. Kara.
Sure, I'll ask a question. Sorry, I put my video on. And I will admit that I work in the government, but can you speak a little bit about, I think that before I worked in the government, I didn't have a good sense of what the government did and the range of possibilities that of things the government can do. Just so maybe speak to sort of what surprised you the most about working in the government, and something along those things. Great.
Yeah. So yes, there are lots of different types of government jobs, especially, like I said, in a state as big as California. You can do anything from work in a sort of very professional office-y environment like the one I did to, I had colleagues that went on to do jobs in like inspecting smokestacks at power plants to make sure that they were in compliance. I know people whose job it was to like go out and count fish in the river. So yeah, there are definitely all different kinds of jobs. And I think government gets a bad rap for being like bureaucratic or ineffective. That has definitely not been my experience in any of the government entities that I've worked in. They've actually been some of my most impressive, just smart professional colleagues. The one sort of funny thing that I will say about the getting into California state government is that it's the process of applying to jobs is incredibly arcane and like difficult to navigate. So, for example, to get into a sort of civil service job in California, you have to do an exam, and the exam is really just self-certifying a certain set of skills and degree and training. But it's really hard for people to navigate. So if anybody is ever interested in going through the process of, going into civil service in California, please let me know, because I could put you in touch with somebody who could help you figure out how to go through that application process. The other thing to keep in mind is that, so there's a civil service and then there are appointees, and I have only served in appointed positions in California state government, and getting an appointment is in some ways a totally bizarre job, hiring experience, and in some ways much more similar to getting a normal job. So you submit your resume into a black hole and somebody does or doesn't call you, and you kind of have to try to network to get somebody to call you. And appointed positions are, can be anything from, like, here in California, we have county fairs. And so there are people who are in charge of the county fair, on the county fair board. So you could have a position like that. You could have a full, which is, you get paid maybe $100 a day for going to meetings, or you could have a full-time position like mine. I think people often think about civil service as kind of the only route into government, but appointments are another way in. And another great way that we have into government in the state of California is through fellowship programs. So we have both a Capital Fellows, which works with the legislature, and then an Executive Fellows program, which works with cabinet level agencies in the state. Those programs are specifically designed for people who are, that are young, potentially coming right out of undergrad or have a year or two of experience, and give you the opportunity to work in an agency, but also exposure to basically like the whole gamut of what the state does, which is a nice way to kind of snack at the buffet of state government options and figure out what kind of thing you'd like to do full time. But Carrie, you mentioned you work in government. What's your experience?
I work at the U.S. Department of Energy. So,
oh, awesome.
But I feel like I never had the words to describe what I wanted to do, but I feel like I get to do that, and I get to think broadly, and I feel like I don't serve like a boss trying to make money, but just try to do the right thing and think about how to best spend taxpayer dollars, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Carol, what's your position at DOE?
Well, I don't, it's not my thing, but I work at in energy efficiency and renewable energy, and
that's great.
Lead analysis.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining. Appreciate it. Max, did you have a question?
Yeah, so I had a question. I'm not sure who wants to answer it since you guys are both in the government, but I know there's a lot of talk now about like a national climate bank. I was interested to hear, particularly since California has a lot of representatives and it's more of a progressive state. Kind of like your thoughts on that, and if that's going to be like passed soon, or what do you think the timeline for that is?
A national climate bank, you said? Well, Kara, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. I mean, I don't see anything getting passed with our current Congress, unfortunately, and signed by our current president. Not to be too partisan here, but that's just the political reality. Unfortunately, this has become such a politically polarized issue. So all the more reason to go work for climate candidates at all levels of government, wherever you can support them. There are a lot of states doing interesting work in this regard, though. State of New York has a great green bank. New Jersey, a lot of the states in the Northeast have really good models. Actually, I would say better than we've done in California. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
So one of the things that you emphasized earlier in your comments, and folks, if you have other questions, go ahead and raise your hand, but was that you felt really lucky when you landed early on to work with good people, right? Like at the NRDC. Do you have any clues for how folks can suss that out, right? How to suss out, is there a good organizational fit, and is this a place that you want to participate in? That would be,
Yeah.
because it can be challenging depending on the interview process, right?
Yeah. I think one of the hard things, especially when you're early in your career, is just sort of the power dynamics of an interview process, right? I mean, you're going up against a lot of people for potentially for one job, and it can feel like you don't have much power in the process, and the person who's hiring has it all. But I think it's so important to think of it as a two-directional interview process, right? That you're kind of sussing them out and their organization as much as they are you. And I think there have definitely been jobs that I have wanted and not gotten at organizations that I would have been not been a good fit at culture, just in terms of the organization and the culture. And so I think also just giving yourself a little grace if you don't get it, because sometimes it's a blessing in disguise that it just was not the right fit for you, and you will land in the right place eventually. I was, when I was preparing for this, I remembering that in like one of the probably lows of my all-time lows career-wise, right after Dartmouth, when I was job hunting, at one point I was like responding to ads in the newspaper, which I guess is not even a thing that people do anymore, but I applied to one which ended up being for a job as a food wench at the Renaissance Fair, and like went to an interview with somebody where that's what they were interviewing me for. So I just wanted to put that out there as like a baseline. If you guys are ever feeling really bad about your job prospects, or what, your what opportunities there might be, just remember that I once almost took a job as the food wench at the Renaissance Fair. You will be fine. You will be totally fine.
Iris, go ahead. You get the last question.
Thanks for answering my question. I was going to ask, since you participated in, or you contributed to California's work negotiating international agreements, for example, with China, about climate leadership, what role do you think states can play, especially given a lack of leadership from the federal level, playing a role in leading efforts to mitigate the climate crisis and increase sustainability?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, states are where it's at right now in the US. And if, depending on how the election goes, maybe where it's at for the next 4 years, at least. And I think, especially in the United States, given sort of the way our government's structured, states actually have quite a bit of latitude to make agreements. Obviously there are some limitations on states' abilities to, enter into a formal treaty, for example, with another government. But what we learned from the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement basically is that it's not necessarily the formality or the sort of nature of the agreement. A lot of people were really fixated on the idea that it had to be legally binding. What we've learned is like countries will blow through legally binding commitments if that's what they decide to do. And so what we really need to work towards, and I think are working towards, is a more cooperative environment where we're building coalitions of the willing, whether those are coalitions of countries or coalitions of countries and states or coalitions of states and cities, and collaborating and sharing best practices and sharing what works, because we don't really have time for California to go through the process of learning it, and then Mexico to go through the process of learning it, and then Jiangsu, we need to be taking learnings that are working in jurisdictions and just getting a whole lot better at scaling those everywhere that we can, because we just don't have the time. So I've spent a lot of my professional career working on state cooperation, so you're getting a biased answer here because I think it's really important. But yeah, I think it's a really exciting area to work in. I think it's going to be an exciting area to work in, even if we do get a change in administration at the federal level. I think we're still going to need states to be pulling out all the stops, right? Because we just need everybody to be pulling out the stops. And the thing I really love about working at the state level, especially in a state like California, is it's big enough to get to do big picture work and really be strategic, but it's specific enough that you get to see the impact of what you're doing at a community level. So like when I was doing border work, I would get to go to the community and go to community meetings and talk to the people who lived by the river that was polluted. And, that it feels different doing that kind of work than sometimes doing UN work where it feels really big, but sometimes you have no idea whether anybody is listening or reading what you're developing or following the agreement. So yeah, I'm a fan of the state.
Thank you so much.
That's a great way. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for your question, Iris. That's a great way to wrap things up. I think that one of the things I struggle with in the climate space is there's a lot of tough news out there, and I think that having that sense of working at the state level is a really important opportunity space. That's a really great way to wrap things up. Aimee, thank you so much for being with us today. I just want to show up for folks. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this with a screen share. What's coming next in our series? Let's see. So I'll make this into a real slide. I did it. Okay. So take note. This Friday, the Jones Seminar, hosted by Thayer, is on a building energy topic. Next week's Alumni Sparks is Abby Hopper, class of '93, who is on our Urban Institute Advisory Board, and she's the CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association in the States. And then next Tuesday's DEC Energy Seminar looks at health impacts and air pollution with Laura Pollan at Dartmouth. So good things coming up. Thank you all again so much for being here. A big shout out to Aimee for participating. Thank you so much. And
if anybody wants to follow up or has questions, please feel free. I don't know, Amanda, if they can reach out to you or.
Absolutely.
But yeah, please don't be shy.
Absolutely. I'm happy to put you in touch. And good to see everybody tonight. Everybody stay safe, stay well, try to get outside and get some fresh air when you can. And we are looking forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks again, everybody. Take care. Have a good night.
Bye. Thanks.